Malachi Martin gave a series of interviews to Bernard Jansen in the 1990s. He later published those, Mr. Jansen did, in a transcript form, which you can purchase on his website at Triumph Communications. I recommend you go find the print copies or buy the CDs of them from him. The copies that you find on YouTube are actually illegal copies and are violating Mr. Jansen's copyright rights. So I recommend you go visit his website and get the copies yourself. I have his permission to use clips from time to time, like I am today, of his interviews. So, if you would, consider visiting the Triumph Communications website to purchase legal copies of these long interviews. They are the best interviews with Father Malachi Martin that you will ever hear. And in this interview, Father Malachi Martin is describing essentially what we call synodality today. He is describing the situation in the church where you can't find the faith in most places anymore, that there is something different being taught. And he gives you the uncomfortable answer to where it came from, that it came from the very top of the church itself. Here's Mr. Bernard Jansen and Father Malachi Martin.
This is the second in a series of interviews with Father Malachi Martin. It is being recorded in his home in New York. Father, in this discussion, we're going to take a look at the situation from the perspective of the average layman in the pew. He's starting to realize that in many cases, in virtually all cases in fact, something is going wrong in the world, something is going wrong in the church. And we'll start right with his home and his family. And many parents are finding it very, very difficult to raise their children because there's all these influences on them that seem to be anti-Christian. Could you maybe comment on the difficulties that a family has in raising its children, and what are the sources of these difficulties?
Yes, it's worth talking about that, Bernard, because the mass of Catholics are laymen and laywomen with children and jobs and homes, and they live in certain areas, and they have to cope with the situation in their areas. And the universal experience in the West, forgetting for the moment the East in the sense of the former Soviet Empire or the Far East, but talking about the West, that is North America, South America, and Western Europe and Australia and New Zealand. It's the same story everywhere. From all the magazines and books that come out, it's quite obvious that nowadays it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, extremely difficult, requiring heroic virtues to rear your children and to yourself and your wife, or yourself and your husband, to behave in a way which formerly was regarded as normally Catholic. What has happened, and why is it so difficult? And is it going to change? And are you simply out of step? Should you be in step with the general march and stop worrying about things? Look, there are a few things we must comment on, first of all. The essence of Catholicism. You see, in my life, I have found non-Catholics, Greeks, Russians, Syrians, Protestants of all kinds, very pious and good. I mean, sometimes they were saints in my estimation. But missing was one Catholic ingredient. One typically Catholic ingredient. And if you don't find this ingredient, you haven't got Catholicism. It's this. If you examine the entire sweep of Catholic theology and pastoral care over the centuries, down to the middle of this century, you'll find that Catholicism meant many things. It's a rich storehouse, by the way, which we're neglecting nowadays. But it's a rich storehouse, but one note always came out. There is a thing called Catholic intimacy with the divine. What does it consist of? Oh, listen, apparently very simple things. It's prayer to the Blessed Virgin. It's devotion to the angels. It's novenas. It's the Blessed Sacrament being visited for 5 minutes to say hello, to console our Lord, to talk to him, to ask him about the problem of that mortgage, to talk about that child who's playing truant, to talk about your difficulties with your wife or your husband. Then it's benediction. It's the repetition of hymns. It's the constant flow of thoughts and devotions and recommendations from the Pope through the bishops to the people, and from the people through the bishops to the Pope, and pilgrimages. And it is this network of intimacy with all things belonging to heaven, because Catholicism set out to establish on earth a replica of what heaven is, so that you can have the food of angels every day, and you can assist at the supreme sacrifice of Jesus, and you can embrace his wounds every day in Holy Communion, and you can talk to Our Lady and get her help, and your boys can grow in the image of Christ, and your girls can grow in the image of Our Lady. And then there would be special people set aside, devoted to him, like priests and nuns and religious orders. And then there would be the occasional special event like a pilgrimage or a special mission. But it all centered on this uniquely Catholic trait of intimacy with the divine. We were allowed to have our conversation with heaven. As St. Paul says, our conversation is with heaven on this earth. Now, what normal people have found is that suddenly that is cut off. Suddenly they are expected to dialogue with each other. Suddenly they're expected to regard the priest as somebody the same as them. Suddenly they're supposed to treat Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament as something very separate from their lives. Suddenly they're supposed to engage in sociological and in environmental studies instead of studying anything about their faith. Suddenly they find that the rosary is no longer prominent and is not sold even in churches. Suddenly, in other words, everything is taken out from under them. They find their children coming home from school saying, they're very good, they're just as good as us, only they have different faith. Then they find the bishops writing on purely sociological and anthropological questions and political questions, no longer have their stream of devotion and teaching about the life of Jesus, about hell, about heaven, about sin, about purgatory, about the truths of our faith. All this has suddenly gone. It's been cut off. That's the basic obstacle they find today. The result is that they find that what they thought was Catholicism is no longer Catholicism. They find that at Mass, they're not supposed to spend time in thanksgiving. They're supposed to sing hymns, which no longer are Catholic hymns. Sometimes they're hymns to nature. Sometimes they're poems about men and women. Sometimes they're quotations from... And then they find that at Mass itself, there's no longer the devotion centralized on the altar. It is centralized on somebody dressed in leotards doing a dance. Or it's centralized in peculiar banners and in new forms of expression, even drawn from natural, say, events like storms and seas that no longer have a spiritual vocabulary. Everything has changed suddenly. What did happen? What produced this? Well, if you see ever an overall phenomenon affecting millions of people, and there are millions of people in the two Americas and in Europe, and it is all stamped in one way and comes at you suddenly, comes at them all, you can be sure that it didn't happen by chance. In other words, we know now that this has been a concerted plan being put in action by an organized body of men. The difficulty is that since it is so universal, we know that it started at the top. It didn't start in one diocese. It didn't start in one country. It started in Rome. Because the church is so arranged that the pipeline from Rome flows into all dioceses. And we can track now through the various pontifical organizations and through the communications in those pontifical organizations, we can track the instructions and the directives given, so that overall in the church, in the West, in Europe, in the Americas, in Australia, and New Zealand, this message would go out loud and clear. This is the way you do it. This is how you conform.
Father Malachi Martin has been much maligned, mostly due to his speaking out on things that happened in the church. People making all sorts of wild accusations against him, claiming he was some sort of agent for foreign powers and all sorts of other bizarre nonsense. His name is in the process of being cleared now, thanks to the work of a friend of his in life, Mr. Rob Marrow, who now has a book available on Amazon and elsewhere about Malachi Martin, including some details that most people will not be aware of unless they read the book. I do highly recommend you read it. I have read it already. I will have Mr. Marrow on to discuss the book here in the near future. But does what Father Malachi Martin say here sound familiar to you? Does this situation in your parish that he describes sound familiar? It should. I've seen it myself. I have seen a parish where the priest sounded like a carnival barker giving his homily, and his cantor sounded like a lounge singer. And the homily was the least offensive thing imaginable. And all too many stories like that. We have them all. All of us do. Let me know what you think of what Father Malachi Martin had to say here in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly does help. Sharing this on social media helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.